Good afternoon. Man, I can't really see all of you, but it is really good to be back at S4 and see everybody out there. So I thought, anyway, yes, my name is Bryan Singer, for those that don't know me. I represent our OT portion of our global incident response team for Accenture. And so I thought we'd have a little bit of fun with cyber family-friendly stuff hits the fan. Lessons learned from the front lines in OT incident response. But I thought what we might do is we might start with a couple of movie quotes to kind of get things moving a bit. A little older movies. We'll have a little fun here. So, and this is very early in Keanu Reeves' evolution to becoming the badass known as John Wick, right? Very early in his career. He played a hostage crisis manager in a movie called Speed in 1994. So his partner, Harry Temple, played by Jeff Daniels, says, all right, pop quiz, airport, gunman with one hostage. He's using her for cover. He's almost to the plane. You're 100 feet away. What do you do? Jack, played by Keanu Reeves, goes, shoot the hostage, right? So let's do another one. And I'm going to spare everybody. If anybody watched The Hunt for Red October, Sean Connery and a horrible Scottish rendition of a Russian accent, I'm going to spare you the Alabama interpretation of that same thing. But Marco Ramia says, Ryan, they're in a nuclear submarine and they've got an actor in there they're trying to confront. It says, Ryan, be careful what you shoot at. Most things in here don't react too well to bullets. Jack Ryan, played by Alec Baldwin, says, right. So here we go, guys. Pop quiz. Overnight, you are the lead crisis manager. Overnight, 10 plants rapidly decelerated, okay? In other words, uncontrolled shutdowns, and dozens more were shut down out of an abundance of caution. A threat actor is persistent in the environment and has deployed ransomware. Right? The investigation is mere hours underway, and the plants have already started coming back up online. The IT incident response team is shouting, slow down. The plants are shouting, speed up, because every moment we're down, they're losing ground against their competitors. What do you do? What are you going to do? We're going to shoot the hostage, quote unquote, production. Unfortunately, time and time again, this is what we see. We see organizations that basically, because they don't understand their environment well, they end up basically creating a self-inflicted wound that never had to be that bad. So sorry to disappoint everybody today. I'm going to really try to avoid shooting much of anything, okay? Our challenge from multiple live IRs, I've done dozens and dozens and dozens of investigations over the years. We're working with Accenture for a few years now and had quite a bit of experience there as well. We really want to try to prevent those self-inflicted wounds, self-inflicted damage to operations, right? We want to continue to restore plant operations. We need to be able to bring plants back up, but as you've probably said many times over the years, our job is to maintain, in security, maintain safe and efficient operations as much as possible. And if we can't assure safe and efficient operations, we want to be able to bring plants down safely, controlled, and then have a safe return to service procedure. All right? Our IR challenges, the incident response challenges, we need to be able to cleanly extract an OT data set out of all the IT collections to be able to gather meaningful data about what the threat actor is doing and whether or not they targeted IT. All right? Hardening our OT systems, a lot of times in an act of an investigation, we're trying to start plants back up. Most IR investigations I've seen take anywhere from days or weeks to months in some cases. So obviously we can't leave our plants down that much. We can't leave them down that long. There's just no way we'll ever recover from that. So a lot of times we're trying to harden our plant environments in flight while we're doing all these other activities. Right? Gaining. You'll hear me say this a few times. It's one of my favorite phrases now. It's gain, maintain, and assure. You want to gain and maintain positive control over the OT environment. And if you'll just bear with me, I'll explain that more a little bit later. Right? Now, so we have some competing priorities that we often have to deal with here. Within OT, and I know this is a bit of an eye chart, but these slides will be provided, I'm sure. But from an IT and an OT perspective, a lot of times we're dealing with very competing priorities. And let me give you just a couple of examples in the interest of time. All right. A really good one is, any type of major OT incident response that you're working on, any type of incident response in general, you're going to have plants down, you're going to have plants trying to come back up, you're going to be talking to executives on a regular basis, all the way up to the CEO, 2 or 3 times a day. There's a lot of activity, and there's multiple things happening. So within the OT environment, obviously we're talking about bringing our plants up, maintaining our plants, continuing to produce, continuing to ship, continuing to do whatever we do, right? Within the IT, they have different sets of pressures. For example, if there are data leaks, let's use GDPR as just one single example, there are going to be regulatory clocks that start as soon as you become aware of certain types of events. those obviously are going to end up having very competing priorities in many cases. And a lot of times, one thing I've been noticing too is, I mentioned being obviously the chairman of 62443 for about 12 years. We've been rolling out standards for many years, policy, governance programs. We've been talking about it. It's all lip service until you actually get to see how things break down when there's this much chaos in an environment. That is when you start to really see when companies that have good governance structures, where the CIO or the CISO has direct access into maintaining operations within the plant, all the way up, from the, like I say, the phrase goes from the shop floor to the top floor, right? Versus ones where they're hammering these relationships out for the first time, and it's the CIO or the CISO being held accountable for what's going on, but it is the first time they've even talked to the plant environments in many cases, all right? So OT, a lot of times, another one I'll highlight, regulatory obligations are often going to be towards safety, environmental, and IT, they're going to be more legal. They're going to be more dealing with data privacy breaches and things of that nature. And not to mention, if you're a global company, dealing with that in lots of different time zones, lots of different countries, lots of different regions. So let's do this, though. Let's take a quick step back, and let's talk about how to prevent or limit your worst day ever, right? Your OT incident response, my job is to show up with our team and help you through that worst day. So what we often see, no separation between IT and OT. And it's hard to believe that we're having this conversation 20 years. We've come so far, yet we still have such a ways to go. No separation between IT and OT, totally flat networks, right? Limited identity management, or a converged Active Directory. In other words, no separate IT and OT engineering domains, right? What we often hear, well, we've been thinking about doing this for a long time. We've been planning this for a long time, and we just hadn't really gotten around to it. Or the one I often hear as well is, well, we've got really good teams, and we've maintained a really good control over our Active Directory so far. We think we've got this under control, right? What we all too often find ourselves saying, and I've said this to many a client now, this is bad. There was absolutely no reason it had to be anywhere near this bad, right? So I've seen the architectures, I've heard all the stories, I've looked at it, and you know what? And I used to have a lot, like some in this room probably, had plenty of arguments and heated debates with our clients about, look, this is why you need to do this stuff. Really don't find a great need to do that anymore, because what I will tell you is the people that have the worst days ever in an incident response scenario, those things are the common themes that we see repeated over and over and over again, right? So obviously you saw the see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil, and that made me think of another movie quote, the 1989 movie, See No Evil, Hear No Evil, where Richard Pryor is a blind man, Gene Wilder plays a gentleman by the name of Dave who's a deaf man, and together they bumble their way through solving a murder, right? So not really directly related, but I thought this quote was funny. Dave, we're in a warehouse, you just hit a cow. I think we better back up. So let's back up a little bit. Take it from your friendly neighborhood incident responder. Again, if you want to have a recipe for assuring that you're going to have a very bad day, not having separation between IT and OT. And what do I mean by that? I'm not talking about VLANs. I'm not talking about layer 2 separation. I'm talking about one or more firewalls with a DMZ, IDMZ, industrial DMZs, whatever you want to call it, all right? Gaining and maintaining positive control over IT and OT communications. And what do we mean by that, all right? This is normally, if you want to get technical for a moment, this is layer 3 and layer 4 at the OSI. In other words, I want to be able to control and know what data is flowing between IT and OT and understand the data flows within the OT environment, and I want the ability to be able to control that. I want to be able to write access control lists. I want to be able to implement firewall rules. I want to be able to have certain things that I can either sever or maintain, or I can control how data flows to the environment, and that I have the right tools to be able to do diagnostics and inspection, security monitoring. And then lastly, that I have a good baseline of my network health so that I know when we've had a shutdown of operations, I know whether or not it's safe to return to service. All right? Creating and maintaining OT-specific playbooks. How many times I've worked in an IR now where there's not even any playbooks, period, or there's nothing really worked out ahead of time from an OT perspective, right? We're going to get more into the details of OT responses in a little bit and why they're a little bit different. But access control and remote support, this is a common theme seen over and over and over again. So we've seen, thankfully, few times, but we have seen threat actors that see like weak password policies on Active Directory that then appear to go back and start testing other things like, TeamViewer connections or other remote connections that might bypass that firewall. And we've actually seen this in, thankfully, fairly few, but there have been a few cases around this, okay? So this is where I'm often asked about the OT NMS type tools, network monitoring tools. And I hope, Dragos, I hope for clarity, Forescout, Nozomi, I hope they can all forgive me. I'm going to lump everybody into one category here. However, again, one of the challenges I see with these tools is, again, they have a lot of capability, but a lot of times if they're already there and deployed, they can be very useful in an investigation. If they are not there in an investigation, a lot of times it represents too high of a bar. It's a barrier to entry to actually gaining more data. So we have to understand where those tools can be effectively utilized, okay? One thing I will say on those types of tools, there is a lot of value in them, but if they're not already in place when an investigation starts, normally what I find is the value of those tools actually is later on. It's going to be a number of days or weeks into the investigation when we're really trying to start about returning plants to normal operations. Those tools can be deployed, configured, maintained. They can give us a lot of useful information later in the incident response, but at the beginning of it, a lot of times, if they're not already there, they're going to be a little bit of a limitation to actually aid in our investigation. Plus, I also want to bring something else up. We don't have enough incident responders, period. If we don't have enough incident responders, period, you can also imagine within the OT arena, we really don't have enough incident response, right? So I do a lot of training for people. We do a lot with internally and externally, really trying to grow the next generation of IT and OT security professionals, especially in the area of incident response. It's one that's becoming more and more important to me. And this is where I actually do find, and I will give some serious props to one particular open source tool that I've become a very big fan of, and that's actually the DHS tool they produced called Malcolm, right? When I first looked at it about a year or so ago, I wasn't very impressed. Some of the later versions, I've actually worked out some workflows with it. And while we have a significant amount of tooling within our incident response practice, one of the big challenges that I've come up with, again, is actually getting that OT data set out of an existing IT data set. And I've always been a big fan of a lot of open source tools. This is more of a personal opinion, not necessarily company represented. I've always been a big fan of a lot of the open source tools. And when I was was doing some searching a while back, I was like, oh yeah, I forgot. I really do like the open source database and network tool called Moloch, which is now known as Archimay. And it's like a lot of incident responders, really like Bro and Zeek. Well, one of the things that tool did is they put together Bro and Zeek integration into the Archimay tool very, very cleanly. Obviously, I don't want to get into technical details of that, but one thing I have found that made that tool very useful is I had a single pane of glass that gave me a very quick snapshot of all the OT, the ICS and OT data sets within everything we'd already collected. And then I was able to take all those other tools that we use, including things like Nozomi and Forescout, and those data, then as we gathered those data sets, all they did was enrich the data set that I was currently looking at. It made it very rapid for us to proof the environment against, and constantly check when we got new indicators of compromise, constantly check that environment to see whether or not it changed anything about the analytic and how we were doing our incident response. So again, the reason I bring that up is again, there's a lot of other tools that we use. However, I do bring that up because if you're interested in incident response, I highly recommend starting to get familiar with tools like Wireshark, Security Onion, and like I said, the one have been using quite a bit lately has been the Malcolm tool because it gives you a great way to start understanding how a lot of these tools and technologies work. And then if you come into an environment and you have some of these other commercial tools, they're going to make a lot more sense to you. You're going to be able to aid in what you're doing. So when all else fails, that talks about how to kind of prevent your worst day. When all else fails, at the end of the day, we do know sometimes the threat actor is going to get in. The single most important job that I think that in any IR team right now for an OT perspective is that crisis management function, okay? It is understanding the implications of what you're doing, understanding the implications of what an IR team is doing. So I really do try to highlight this crisis management function is very, very critical. So crisis management for OT/IR in 4 easy pieces. This is a bit of a joke, of course, but crisis management for OT, key to success: 1 part operator, 1 part safety, 1 part IT, 1 part Belgian Malinois. Is anybody familiar with dogs? I have German Shepherds, love them to death. Have you ever seen a Belgian Malinois? Ever seen one actually seen one in action? I've heard it likened to a German Shepherd crossed with the Tyrannosaurus Rex or T-Rex on speed. Right? These are very active, very busy, very sharp dogs. Little bit of a joke, of course. However, highlights that crisis management function. You are going to be doing a lot of things very, very quickly. You're going to be proofing your OT data sets to see whether or not you see threat actor behavior targeted at OT. That's going to be a really key thing we'll discuss here in just a moment. You're going to be working with the IR teams that are probably rolling out containment strategies, like, for example, turning on the Windows firewall. And they're going to be rolling out EDR solutions, and they're going to be doing it very, very quickly, and probably not checking whether or not, whether or not that Windows firewall is going to interact with and cause harmful interaction to control system software, for example. All right? So you're going to see plants going back up, you're going to see them going back down, and really just trying to be in front of that activity is a very important part for that crisis management function. Your job there as that crisis manager is to categorize that OT incident and constantly be aware of that. So keep in mind, again, what I was talking about a moment ago, getting that data set to work with, right? And then analyzing your new IOCs, your new indicators of compromise and new threat intelligence to constantly evaluate whether or not you're going to need to escalate and attest to additional resources. Coordination between your IT and OT data streams, and then last but not least, it's either maintaining safe operations or coordinating that safe return to service procedure, right? Proofing the environment to make sure that it's okay to return to service. And what do you watch for once you do return? So what do I mean by proofing this and categorizing the attack? Let's get into, I try to always categorize an incident into one of 4 categories. Okay, by the way, little known fact, 76.8% of all statistics are made up on the spot, all right? So I will tell you that about 90 to 95% of the incidents stay in these first 2 categories. This is what we want, okay? Those first 2 categories. IT compromise, where no OT assets are impacted, okay? And what are we doing in that one? We're just making sure that there was never any lateral movement into the OT environment. So going again with that scenario a moment ago about having your worst day ever, the clients that we've seen that have some of the worst day ever, that have those completely converged, no separation between IT and OT, this is very, very difficult. And it's a huge ground game to make sure that OT systems were not impacted in any way, right? Make sure there's nothing else we need to worry about. So first category, IT impacted, OT is not. Okay? The second category, where 95% of our statistics on the spot land, is going to be OT systems are impacted, and then the job of the crisis management and the IR team is to prove that they weren't targeted, right? So in this case, I'll give you an example of this in a moment, but in this case, what we're doing is we know OT was hit, but we want to make sure that it wasn't like, okay, the new in controller or something else that moved deeper into the system. When we get down into category 3, this is, again, we want it to stay in the first 2 categories. When you start trying to mobilize your resources, now getting into level 3 and level 4 is a whole different ball of wax, right? In this case, we need to figure out whether or not we need to mobilize a lot of additional resources. And these could be anywhere from engineers, OT-specific teams, all kinds of other things, including federal response, all right? And what we're doing on level 3, this is what I call insider or insider equivalent attacks, okay? Insider attacks, I hate to be blunt about this, but insider attacks we often see in cases of like layoffs, terminations, people that come back into an environment, or during labor negotiations and strikes and things like that. Sometimes we need to be very wary of insider type attacks that could be conducted in an environment, or insider equivalent. These are threat actors that have taken days, weeks, months, or years learning your environment as well as you know it. Okay? So they have inside equivalent information, whether they got it through fraud and collusion, whether they got it through research, whether they got it through some other means. They have inside equivalent information about your environment, and they represent a very significant threat. Get into the last category, and this is what I will call just the deep insert OT attacks. I mean, even the time since I put these slides together, in controllers now come out. So this is the Stuxnet, son of Stuxnet, in controller. These are the types of things that highly target an OT environment, right? Your job as an incident responder is to do your best to understand whether or not you're going to even need to move into level 3 or level 4, because that mobilizes a whole bunch of different resources. If you stay in level 2, if you have good IT-OT separation, the only thing that we're ever going to have to do really is just watch for lateral movement between IT and OT. Look for backdoor attacks into IT and OT. As long as we don't see those, normally you're going to be safe to continue to operate the way you were, right? If you have no separation at all, you're going to have to spend a lot of time really proofing to make sure that you are in level 3, or those systems have not been impacted in some other way, level 3 or level 4. All right. So a lot of times you hear, well, just shut it off, right? Just go ahead and contain the threat actor by just shutting everything off, disconnect. Well, that may or may not be possible. Organizations that have taken their time to plan this and their business continuity and disaster recovery plans ahead of time, probably so. If you try to do this live in an IT environment, live in an environment where you've not done this work, one of the things you're going to run into right away is if you don't have separation between Active Directory, if you don't have a separate engineering domain, you probably can't completely shut that connection down, right? And even if you do shut it down, do you have control over the several thousand remote access connections that are going on in your environment at the same time? I've seen companies shut down the IT, OT, or shut down that access, that access to the environment and ignore the fact they've got VPNs and remote access and remote server, all kinds of other things that just bypass that IT, OT firewall entirely. And if you do sever that connection and those things are still going on, you've just cut yourself off at the knees in the ability to detect and respond to more attacks by the threat actor. So is it safe to return to production, okay? OT responders, they must evaluate the health of the ICS network. So one of the other things you really got to watch out for, a lot of times we're conducting kind of a baseline assessment while we're doing the IR. Because if your network is already unhealthy and the industrial protocols are already having a hard time and a hard day, if you add then all the remote support and all the backup and recovery and restoration that you're going to have to do to return to service, the next thing that's going to happen, and we've watched it time and again, you're going to bring that plant right back down. So the question really needs to come, is it safe to return to service? We're going to get into some tools to hopefully help with that. Now, I'm going to get into just one small example here of how like our IT and OT teams need to be able to interact with each other, and that attestation as to whether or not you need to move from level 2 into level 3 or level 4, right? One of the things that will happen, for example, let me give you a quick example. It's one of my favorites, all right? I'll give two. We got a moment for it. So number one, let's say that a laboratory information management system was part of the compromise, and we know the threat actor moved to that, okay? All right, does that now kick off some additional procedures that you need to do for lab or quality checking to make sure that everything's okay, right? Did you think about that ahead of time as part of your response playbooks? Or my favorite is, let's say it's an engineering workstation that's compromised. Well, if it's an EWS that's compromised, one of the things I'm going to do is I'm going to request from our incident response team a forensic image of that workstation so that they then go in and look at like where the programs are stored for all our controllers. And we're going to look at A time, the last time a file was accessed, M time, last time files were modified, C time, when the files were created. We're going to be looking through all that to see whether or not we think that somebody might have either gathered data about or modified the programs that are then in the controllers. And then we're going to be going out whether or not we need to manually proof every controller out there to make sure the ladder logic hasn't been changed, okay? We don't want to get into that scenario if we can avoid it. We really want to stay out of that as much as possible, but we need to be prepared to move to that level, all right? The other thing to really watch for here too is watching if there is an exfil component, where the threat actor has brought hundreds of megabytes or gigabytes or terabytes of data and they've exfilled it off the network. Finding out what's in that exfil, right? Did they get CAD drawings? Did they get PNIDs? Did they get plant safety manuals? Did they get anything else out there that could indicate that, hey, this is just an attempt to exploit and gain money, get a ransom for the Bitcoin? Or is there something else there that this might be an early indicator of another attack yet to come because they're gaining that insider equivalent information by gathering that data off the system? So, and I have seen process information in exfils a number of times now, and it does present some kind of uncomfortable questions. So try to get down to some quick tools here for you, as quick as possible. The thing I like to work with now is three basic concepts: minimum viable architecture, minimum viable process, and minimum viable controls. MVA, MVP, and MVC. And the one we'll put on the bottom there too, because it is key and important. You do need to have this aligned with your business continuity program. So minimum viable architecture, the network assets that you have out there, the server assets, the backups. Now, a couple of key questions on your minimum viable architecture and getting into minimum viable process. Things like your PNIDs, your plant safety manuals, any of those type of architecture diagrams. Do you have those? Do you have them under control? Do you have paper backups? Because if you've lost all that, especially like plant safety manuals, you may not be legal to even operate. So these are questions that you need to work out as part of your minimum viable architecture. Next piece is minimum viable process. What equipment needs to be running? What's the efficiency it needs to be running at? What raw materials? What type of storage you need? What type of quality test you need to be able to execute in order to make sure that you're still producing safe product, right? Or insert whatever that product may be, whether it be chemicals or power or razor blades or whatever it might be, right? Third one, minimum viable controls. This means the control over the environment. Whether or not you can, let's say, for example, WannaCry spread heavily over 139 and 445, the TCP ports, right? Can you positively close that access down throughout the environment and know the impact of doing so, right? We don't want to just, I looked at Log4j response and it was fascinating to me. The companies were intentionally breaking their applications because the risk of breaking the applications by deleting the Log4j stuff was actually lower than it was to allow the compromise to move forward. These are things we definitely want to avoid. So minimum viable architecture, minimum viable process, minimum viable controls. If you can assure those three things and align it with your business continuity plan, at that point, I say you are safe to return to service in one fashion or another. We call it authorization to operate. So let's tie it all together with the 5 minutes that we have remaining. 3 pillars for success. This is what I really like to focus on. Preparedness. Do you have response playbooks for your OT environment, right? There's another concept I like here is what we call, I use heavily now, is called pre-approved actions. Pre-approved actions. What are the things that you are allowed to do without any other authorization? Give you an example. You had a industrial materials client a few years ago that had a large incident response, and they had one site go uncontrolled shutdown. They were shutting down a couple others, and they all started debating amongst each other about what to do. In that meantime, it went to several dozen sites and caused them a lot bigger outage than they ever should have had. Right? Pre-approved actions. That MVA, MVP, MVC, that's a really useful tool I found in kind of coming up with what those pre-approved actions need to be. Preparedness, right? So playbooks, tabletop exercise, resilience, skill training, skill ups, positive control. Gain, maintain, and assure positive control over the environment. Do you know your data flows? Do you know what systems and data you need in order to operate? Can you control those? Can you monitor them? Can you shut them down? Can you survive with or without them, right? Positive control is a really key aspect of whether or not it is safe to return to service. And then risk management, again, if you're doing this IR, they're going to be watching 2 things. They're going to be watching a numerator and a denominator. How many systems are compromised? How many systems have been fixed, right? They're going to be watching that heavily. They're going to be watching those regulatory clocks. Can you effectively communicate what the risk is of either maintaining or returning systems operation? I've had several times now that we've had plants that have been down. They start getting excited and they start returning plants back up too quickly. They turn around, they go right back down, and then they're wondering why. Or the IR teams, internal or external, are actually causing them more harm than good. Getting your hands around that crisis management function, very key to limiting that type of impact, okay? Another concept, and again, I'm just dropping a couple of tools on you now, because another concept I have found very useful is to contrast indicators of compromise, which we're usually doing hunting and eradication in an IT environment, with what we're calling indicators of aberrant behavior, or IAB, within a process, right? These are all those weird things. And the more colloquially I like to say, if it looks weird, it is weird until you prove otherwise in an incident investigation, right? So what are those things that are indicators of physical behavior that we know are problematic, that we need to pay attention to? And this template is one I use. Now, normally, if I'm doing this for like a client, there'd be several columns here, including like the observations and the impacts. But these are the way I communicate back to the client. What about your protocol control? Can you control your data flows? Endpoint control. Do you have visibility of your endpoints? Do you know what all your assets really even are? Network control. Do you have positive control over the environment? Data control. Do you know your data flows? Malware prevention. Obviously, you guys can follow that one. Remote support. Suspect communications. Because, quite often when we start an IR, we see a threat actor behavior in an environment. It's not the only threat actor behavior in the environment. Hopefully, it's all fairly minimal, but it's several times now, it's not been the only one, and keeping those investigations separate or kicking off a new one could be really important. Right? Safety, I should move safety to the top, but is it safe to even operate? Right? And then asset management. Lastly, here's a little bit of an OT incident response checklist. Really looking at understanding, this is something you leave behind, really, but understanding, do you know your recovery point objectives? Do you know your minimum viable architecture? Do you know what it means to product? Do you have prearranged plans? Does your MSP support your program or not? Right? I've had some IRs where we found that the MSP the service level agreements were not tuned to the threat model they were worried about. So we actually helped our clients go out and bid for a new MSSP based upon the new criteria. So that's really where I will leave things, kind of wrapping up on that. So I hope everybody really enjoyed the presentation, obviously. One thing I will say, I have seen a huge need, and this is something we're doing. This is a bit of a shameless plug, but we've seen a huge need that we need more incident responders. But not only do we need more incident responders, we just need more people that understand the incident response process for OT systems. And based out of our Houston CFC, the Cyber Fusion Center in Houston, where we have a lot of industrial applications, we actually have simulated cyber events that people can understand what would be the impact of the process of an OT attack. One of the things we're running is we actually have been working with an alliance with another company called Cloud Range to produce a virtual range to complement that, where we bring people in and we just give them exposure to what does an OT incident actually look like? How do you work through those 4 categories? How do you do the crisis management? Because what we mainly need to train people on is not how to be incident responders right away, but how to work with an incident response team. Right? So if you're at a refinery, you're at a food producer, and you have an incident, when somebody shows up, whether it be Accenture, whether it be Dragos, whether it be Mandiant, whether it be PwC or DHS, when you have that team show up, how do you direct them on how they actually need to operate? So with that, I will wrap it up as I am at time, and I really appreciate it. And again, very good to see everybody at S4, and I look forward to seeing you the rest of the show.